Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Archival Discourses. I'm very lucky to be joined for this show once again by Praise of Folly. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Hitman?
I'm fine, thank you, and great to have you back. And so tonight the topic is going to be civic nationalism. So I think this is an idea that we very much need to talk about and critique because I just think it's so prominent. I think in a lot of Western political scene, and I just think we need to destroy it once and for all, basically. So, any sort of initial thoughts you have on this topic at all, or?
Yeah, civic nationalism. I mean, the if okay, so when the United States was founded, and almost all the immigrants are European, even all the way up until like the late 19th century. There was definitely challenges in integrating them into the population, but they were still all European. So the system still kind of worked. But now that we're bringing in people that are completely not European at all and don't have any of the same values, it's really starting to show that you just can't keep stuffing the bag with more marbles before it breaks.
No, certainly, and ultimately, I think it's also completely deluded as to what it actually makes a nation or a people. You can't just, to use a term AA likes to use. It's borrowed clothes. Ultimately, you just can't keep handing out borrowed clothes to people.
Yeah.
And it's
Well,
also
this is the result of the fact that the United States is basically an oligarchy. It doesn't have any basis in a ethnic or cultural identity because all it cares about is money. And so if that's all you care about, then you don't really care about preserving any sort of ethnic group within your country unless you think that that might be a precondition for your economy to run. But of course, that's not how they think currently.
no, certainly not. No, and unfortunately, because it's interesting, especially when you look at because I think in terms of the influence of civic nationalism, I think the Britain or the UK is the most susceptible to it. Because if you look at compare like our Reform Party, our supposedly right wing populist party, to most of the other European populist parties, I'd say Farage has very much always been this sort of civic nationalist. You know, the problem with immigration isn't that we're bringing too many; it's that there are the wrong race or the wrong culture. It's just that it's too much. We've got a population explosion, and it's like, yeah, I get that it's a quantity problem as well, but you're also, I think, missing the fundamentals. You can't just mash all these different peoples together to create a homogenous culture. It just doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and I think what cannot be ignored enough is that, or cannot be emphasized enough rather, is that the current rhetoric around civic nationalism, around all these immigrants, is really hiding the real issue. The fact that Western financial interests are importing large amounts of people into the country in order to suppress wages. And they were doing that all the way back in the 1850s, but of course they were still European. And even though while there were the nativists who opposed, at this point they were mostly Catholic, Irish, and later Italian, the immigration, every time that happens, it's defeated. That native resistance to immigration is always defeated by these forces. And now they've created just a flood. And so rather than talking about the real issue, like the mechanisms that bring these people from Africa, the Middle East, Asia, South America to North America or Europe are constructed. They don't exist in nature. These people don't get on boats like Vikings and sail up to your country. There is an international global system. For example, there's all sorts of NGOs that are getting these human caravans in Central America in order to flood them into the United States. And so the question you have to ask when you step back is who is funding and creating these mechanisms by which people are taken from one part of the world and given to another part of the world. Since they don't exist in nature and they are constructed, who makes them and then who benefits?
No, absolutely. It's largely people like Soros. Ultimately, I think ultimately it is just to create essentially a class of sort of heterogeneous sort of slave caste to just like endlessly slave into as like corporate serfs. Ultimately, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The goal is corporate serfs. Now, the other thing we got to tie into this, since you're bringing up, civic nationalism, is the idea of like a two-tiered caste system where you have like the old European money and financial money, the aristocratic classes that survived, and then the old money, both in Europe and North America, ruling over this like mixed race subhuman caste system that they've created. This is You see this with the Kalergi plan. That was the exact point. He was it a Japanese mother and a German father or something, and Kalergi wanted to turn Europe into this mixed race community like Latin America, ruled by a handful of white creoles.
Yes, because I mostly know about him from his friendship with Julius Evola. But yes, no, that was certainly his plan, and they've certainly made moves towards that. Though the only thing I would say is the one part of the plan that's not working out for them is that they're not really seeing the mass miscegenation that they were hoping for. Largely, the communities are very much like oil and water; they're staying separate.
Well, yeah, that's I remember years ago, Jared Taylor wrote a book about that. How like most people left to their own just self-segregate. Integration is entirely top down and compelled. People don't normally do this.
In fact, going back to the American example, I would say the only real case you see of miscegenation occurring naturally is where you mix two different whiter European peoples together, because I think they're fundamentally much more compatible.
Well, where I guess I don't know. I guess we call it, it's natural in the sense that when the conquistadors took over, they just took all the native women from themselves and created mestizos. It's only really in Latin America where you see large scale miscegenation as a part of the culture.
Well, what was more meaning with America is more the fact that, in America, people like to use this term, oh, I'm an Amerimat. I've got English, German, French, Irish ancestry. I'm a mix of all these different cultures and ethnicities. And well, and that's what I mean. A lot of Americans do have a multifaceted ethnic origins. But what I would say to that is, well, I wouldn't be ashamed of that. You're still, white and in European ultimately. It's not like you're got a bit of bit of Asian, bit of white, bit of black in you. You know what I'm trying to say?
Well, right. So there's a fundamental difference between intermarriage between, say, French, Germans, and Italians on the one hand, and then, say, French and Senegalese, Venezuelans, and Thai on the other.
I know, absolutely. And what I just wanted to do is I've got an article here. I'm just going to bring up. I want to read through because it's got some interesting ideas looking at the origins of how civic nationalism was sort of born or created. So, okay, yeah. So it's from Imperium Press on their Substack. They do a great Substack, lots of good articles. So this one's called "Where Does Civic Nationalism Come From? A Quick and Dirty Guide to Propositionality." So those of you who joined us recently, one of the most important things we do here at the Imperium Press Substack is to give you the tools to defeat your enemies. In this case, conceptual tools. These tools are a potent solvent that will dissolve liberalism. Some, like imperative ethics, are a bit technical, but the tool we're going to introduce today is both powerful and highly intuitive. You can talk about it with your boomer dad, if you're fortunate enough to have a boomer dad that doesn't like civic nationalism. I think you're going to be quite hard to find, but this tool is called propositionality. Propositionality is a very simple idea. Once you see it, you will see it everywhere. And once you see its implications, it will be no mystery why our world is becoming a left-wing hellhole. Propositionality is when propositions exhaust a given domain. In plain language, something is propositional when it's a matter of belief. Isn't everything a matter of belief, though? The fact that we might think so is part of the problem. It shows how deep the rot really is. Some things are not a matter of belief. First, let's stop to think what a belief actually is. A belief is a proposition that can be true or false. Taste is an example of something that isn't propositional. When you like the flavour of strawberries, you're not affirming the truth of the flavour of strawberries. That doesn't make sense because flavour isn't a proposition. An example of something that's propositional would be a scientific theory. Geocentrism, the proposition that the sun rotates around the Earth, may be false, but at least it's not a category error to affirm it as true. You're just mistaken. All sorts of things can be propositional. Religion can be propositional. A Buddhist can say, I affirm the Four Noble Truths, and that makes him a Buddhist. Morality can be propositional. someone can say it's true that you should do unto others as you would have done unto you, and that makes him a nice person. Nationality can also be propositional. The propositional nationalist is the person who says something like anyone can be an American as long as he believes in freedom and equality before the law. The person's birth or history have nothing to do with his nationality. His nationality is a matter of what he believes he holds. This kind of nationalism is more commonly called civic nationalism. All these are examples of propositional identities. Propositional identities are totally fine. We all have them. But if your core identity is a proposition, that's a huge problem. Propositionality has a number of deeply troubling implications. There are many of them, but let's go through just 3. So any initial comments you have off that part of the essay? Or
Yeah, so the idea then that there's the turn at the end of the first introduction is that a nation cannot be a proposition. Now, this is something that maybe they'll explain later, or maybe they just assume their audience is already familiar with. They're therefore assuming that nationhood or nationality is biological or sociological or some sort of material reality rather than just some sort of thought. But now this could just be equivocating on the term nation, but since they admitted religions could be propositions, and that represents a sort of ordered identity. I'm not saying you should, but I don't see why in principle somebody couldn't just say that. Well, this is like this philosophy or this religion or this propositional governing structure is just what we're going to use. Now, that because it sounds like they're trying to create a sort of like logical contradiction, like, oh, well, there's a logical contradiction if you say this versus that. Now, as opposed to sort of a consequentialist argument, which is what we often hear with those on the right. I'm not sure that I would say that it's necessarily the case that you can't have a proposition and a nation. For example, the one thing that I don't really see a lot of engagement with is the Roman Republic and Roman Empire, where the idea of Romanitas was not limited to the Italians and was included Semitic peoples of the Near East and North Africa. So I wouldn't say it's a logical contradiction. And that's not to say it doesn't have complications or issues, but I think that's maybe a little too strong.
Oh, thank you. Well, what I think he's trying to say here is that, look, having a propositional identity is fine. It just shouldn't be your core main identity. So I think what he's getting at is, let's say, I don't know, you're like a white American. He's saying you being a white American, that should be the main dominant part of your identity, the core of what you are. If you're a Christian on top of that, that's fine. That's your propositional identity, and you can be a Christian and live the good Christian way. But at your core, you're white before anything else. And so, for example, I think from what he's trying to say, you have more in common with, say, another white American that may not necessarily be a Christian than you would have with, say, an African American that was Christian.
Right. So this is another interesting thing to bring up here, right? Because now Imperium Press, they're more aligned with the pagan right.
Mike, he is a pagan, yeah.
So it's interesting when he says here that you can have a proposition, but it can't be your sole identity. Is that also an implicit dig at Christians? Because he just said religion can be a propositional identity, and most Christians would say, well, that's the core of my identity.
I definitely think that there's some element of that there. I don't disagree with you. Again, I've listened to Mike a lot and read a lot of his articles, and in his view, I think would very much disagree with what a lot of Christians do, which is put the Christianity as their core identity. He would say, no, your racial heritage or your tribal heritage is more important than your actual religious identification. It's fine to have religious identification. He would say it's more important that you believe in God or have a religion than you be an atheist. But he's just saying, so essentially you could almost say it's like a hierarchy of identities. Your fixed sort of real identity, what you are physically, like your racial heritage, trumps your religious identity, which is propositional.
Okay.
Yeah, so point 1, universalism. Beliefs can't produce any kind of core identity for the simple reason that they're truth apt. They're evaluated in terms of truth versus false. Truth is inherently universal. It makes no distinctions, not even between humans and animals. The sun rotates around the earth or it doesn't, no matter who you are, no matter whether you're a man or a cockroach. Since truth is the same for you as it is for Eskimo or a Zuni tribesman, it can't be used to distinguish along ethnic lines. Again, this is not a problem when it comes to something like geocentrism, because geocentrist is not your core identity, but it's a huge problem when your core identity is propositional. If you're a Buddhist and Buddhism is what matters above all else, then you have no cause to object to your neighbor being a Buddhist, whether or not he's an Eskimo. If your core identity is a belief, then the core fact about you is something that can be readily adopted by anyone. This makes people into a kind of empty vessel just waiting to be filled with beliefs. You probably know this as magic dirt theory, where by some magical operation, just believing the right things changes your essential nature. If our core identity is a belief, then being replaced by other people's is, as long as they hold that belief, simply being replaced by ourselves. 2. Open borders. When we say that our core identity is a belief, this is another way of saying that we exist only epistemically. For someone to question the belief is for them to question your core identity. Your very existence. Liberals are the ultimate propositional identitarians. This is why when you challenge them about their gender confusion or whatever other nonsense they believe, they say, you're questioning my right to exist. Beliefs are not geographically bound, they spread virally, and this includes illiberal beliefs. This makes liberal extremely insecure and constantly worried about fascists under the bed. As long as there is just one person in the world who questions his right to exist, he can't sleep at night. Therefore, he must leave no stone unturned in rooting out everything other than himself globally. Borders are a problem for civic nationalism. They just don't make sense. Civic nationalism is just a kind of liberalism. If you asked Americans, Brits, Germans, and South Koreans who are civic nationalists what makes someone an American, Brit, German, or South Korean, they'll probably say something like believing in freedom and equality before the law. In other words, they would just list a number of liberal beliefs, but then there's no effective difference between any of these countries. What is it? Food, dress? You don't need borders to eat kimchi or wear a dirndl. So borders don't make any sense under civic nationalism because all these things that supposedly make a country what it is aren't geographically or ethnically bound. Civic nationalism, aka propositional nationalism, is just a halfway house to globalism. And this, I think, gets back to what we were saying before about the idea that, you know, the elites just want everybody to be these kind of corporate serfs, because it's this idea that everybody's just this interchangeable economic unit. It's to their benefit for you to essentially have like no functional difference from like your co-worker, because they just want these machine-like automatons to just slave away in their economic system.
Yeah, can you go back to the first one, universalism?
Sure.
Let's see. There's something he said here that, let me see. Beliefs cannot provide a core identity for their not truth apt. They evaluate. Well, see, this is just a mistaken conception here. Truth apt means something that can be said truly about. So a belief might be true or it might be false. So a belief can be truth apt if it's purporting to give you an account of what is true or what is false. Not so, because I'm not sure what he's saying here, because so he says if the truth is universal, you can't make distinctions between. I don't see that. I mean, let's look at Christianity, for example. It's a universal belief system, which makes claims. But within that schema or framework, it then differentiates different orders of beings, animals, angels, God, and humans, and how they relate to each other. I don't see how one couldn't appeal to that schema to then determine how one would relate to other beings around you. It almost seems like there's a kind of assumed materialism in the sense that, well, we can only make distinctions based on sort of lived or emotive experiences rather than some sort of abstract thinking. I mean, that just seems to me very confused. I'm not sure what he's getting at there in the first paragraph there.
Yeah, after thinking over it again, I do think there is a little bit of inconsistency, because he said that, you know, a belief can't produce a core identity there, but you've also said that it's bad to have a belief as your core identity. Those two terms are contradictory. Either they can be a core identity or they can't be. Right.
So yeah, if there's no choice involved, then you can't even say it'd be bad because you're not making the choice. Because it's the thing that couldn't be done.
And no, certainly. And yeah, but I would say the second point where he said about let's say you're a Buddhist, but you have say an Eskimo as your neighbor who's also Buddhist, and according to civic nationalism, you should be, or what's your Buddhist identity, you should be fine with that. And I guess it opens up another question, because I think there are people out there who sincerely treat their religious identity as their first and main identity, and perhaps that is part of the problems about. So maybe it's not necessarily civic nationalism, because a religious identity is not nationalism; it's just your religious identity. But that in itself, I think, does undermine, you could perhaps say, trying to maintain a more racial or tribal national identity.
Well, with the second paragraph with the issue about the Buddhist, right? If you're a Buddhist and Buddhism is what matters above all else, you have no cause to object to your neighbor being a Buddhist, whether he's an Eskimo or not. Well, that doesn't. Well, are we talking about a Buddhist who's a civic nationalist or a Buddhist who's not? Because I tell you, a lot of the Buddhists in Southeast Asia would not like it. Say China invaded Vietnam or something. When it didn't happen. I mean, China only invaded 79, but they would have resisted. And the other thing is, this is on the assumption that you can't have a belief system which already tells you how you relate to other races. So, for example, many on the right like to criticize Israel because it's basically a racially supremacist religion, Judaism. And the Jew can, within that framework, say, no, I don't want you to be my neighbor and not be, Semitic and Jewish, because that's what my religion tells me. So I don't see how it necessarily follows that any and all abstract thought models must be like this. Only ones that are like civic nationalism or globalism, specifically detailed as such.
Well, with the Israeli case, I would say their identity is more of a kind of like an Ashkenazi extreme racial identity than necessarily a religious Jewish one, though that certainly is an aspect of it.
Right, but I'm just saying, though, just because you have a belief system that's abstract, I don't think follows that. See, because for that statement to be true, you'd have to say that all abstract religious beliefs entail that you can't differentiate between physical objects. I don't see that as an entailment, unless, of course, that's specifically stated in your abstract belief.
No, certainly that's a good point.
And then also, could you go down to the second one, because there was something there I wanted to point out too.
Yeah, sure.
So open borders.
I mean, this point he made. I'll carry on.
Go ahead.
Oh, yes, this point about the idea of the liberals fearing the fascists under the bed, and you're questioning my right to exist. No, I completely agree with that. That is very much the liberal mindset.
Right. So it looks like, from the introduction to the first idea universalism to the second idea open borders, he's trying to set up. Well, we haven't finished the article, so maybe he changed it. Maybe there's a pivot, but it sounds like he's setting up the idea that the threat to white Europeans and heritage Americans in North America due to immigration is the result of an abstract idea, or abstract ideas in general, but specifically the abstract idea that we call civic nationalism. And I'm guessing he's probably going to come around and say, if we could pivot away from having abstract ideas as our fundamental identity, we could stop this. And I find this construction entirely unsatisfying, because the reason why we have the immigration crisis is because we have large corporate firms that have been importing the world into the United States to depress the cost of labor. And also, and this is even when they had European workers coming in. Engels points out that it raises the unit cost of labor organizing. If you have French, Italians, Poles, not French, Italians, Poles, Irish, Jews, the cost of labor organizing goes way up. And this is people that are more or less, all coming from Europe. Now we're including people that aren't coming from Europe. So it drastically increases the cost of labor organizing. So it's not just to reduce the cost of labor to make profits, it's also to disrupt any labor organizing activity. And we can see this with the Whole Foods heat map that The Verge released a few years back, where if it's they didn't say it, but instead of it's homogeneous, which means white men, you need to diversify the workspace because they'll unionize. And it's like, okay, well, so what I would want to say is that these ideas that are being criticized by Imperium Press are the downstream result of an already vested political economic interest that is seeking to justify what it's doing while at the same time hiding what it's doing.
No, certainly. But I think what they're also getting at is the fact that it's obviously the elites obviously push this idea, but the fact is that so many other people in our countries, the white, indigenous people buy into this idea, and I think it's very bad that they do so because it kind of removes any defense to any kind of self-preservation or self-interest.
Well, right, but the question here though is, why is the idea being propagated, and then why is it compelling to heritage Americans? Well, the mechanism by which it's propagated is universities and the media, and they're both controlled more or less because of he controls the purse strings, controls what somebody's going to do by these forces, by these corporate agencies that I've been talking about. And so the idea is, if you just treat it as a bad idea that can be disinfected and then replaced with a good idea, you're still missing a key part of why this is happening in the first place and why the bad idea even exists.
No, that's a fair point. Let's carry on. So, point 3, progressivism. Propositional identities are based on beliefs, and these sorts of beliefs aim at knowledge. The thing about bodies of knowledge is that they get closer to the truth over time. There's no substantive body of knowledge about which we know less now than we did 50 years ago, still more 100 years ago, still more 1,000 years ago, and so on. Another way of putting this is that knowledge is cumulative. This is pretty obvious when it comes to something like science. If you could transport a Neolithic surgeon to the present, you wouldn't dare let him operate on you with that rock in his hand. Science is a body of knowledge, and knowledge gets better over time. But the sorts of beliefs in propositional identities are also aiming at knowledge. Morality is supposedly a kind of knowledge. Buddhism is also a kind of knowledge, and since its core is sets of truth-apt propositions to Four Noble Truths. The problem for propositional identities is that they A, they're bodies of knowledge, and B, bodies of knowledge get closer to truth over time. Knowledge is supersessionist. New knowledge beats old knowledge. Another way of putting this is that knowledge is progressive. So if morality is just a set of propositions, it makes no sense to believe in an old morality, because it would be a world historical first if knowledge actually went backwards over thousands of years. Same with religion. Believing in anything less than the newest development of your religion, or really just the newest religion, would be idiotic if religion were at bottom a set of propositions. But it's interesting he talks about this idea of knowledge progressing and affiliating it with religion, and the idea of swapping out or adopting a new religion. Because in a way, you could kind of see that happen, though, especially when you see the subversion of a lot of modern religions like Christianity. These people have to inculcate this kind of horrific liberal skin suit over it and abandon the actual older true beliefs.
Well, yeah, or you could even look at the Christian tradition where, according to the Old Testament, Israel was the people of God, but then in the New Testament that shifts to the church. So there's a change in religion. But what I'm confused. So is Mike here saying that? Is he saying that it's his belief that knowledge progresses over time? Because that's what it sounded like with the surgeon analogy.
Yeah, that's my interpretation of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, isn't that kind of funny? That actually is the definition of progressivism. That's why 19th and 20th century progressives said that they were scientific, because they were at the cutting edge of what scientific research said at the time. And you wouldn't want to dare go back, would you? So that's interesting that he would say that, because at the same time, he's also going to want to support a more older view of European spirituality with paganism. And that would be going back, which isn't that the problem?
Well, what I think he's trying to say is that he's saying that basically liberals basically take morality and treat morality like knowledge. And so they think morality gets better as time goes on. So we have to get rid of these old, racist and bigoted beliefs and adopt these new liberal ones. I think that's what he's trying to say.
Okay. Now that's certainly how liberals behave. I wouldn't deny that. But he says here, okay, so if our core identity is going to be propositional, liberals really just have got it right. They are ahead of us on everything. The current thing is the best thing. No, that's absolutely not true. That's absolutely not true at all. I mean, if you have, say, a philosophy like, say, Platonism, or a religious belief like Christianity or Buddhism, especially if it's a religious belief which claims you get a revelation from God, that's not going to change. That's the entire point of these monotheistic religions. God has given us this revelation which isn't going to change. Now, it's propositional. These statements that the religious believer claims to have received from God may or may not be true, but they're not going to change. James says in the book of James, the truth handed once for all. So there's no idea that this is going to continually be added to. Not necessarily. Again, you might have a proposition belief that does. See, I think what Mike is doing here is assuming that all propositional beliefs are like civic nationalism, liberalism, and globalism, which is just, I think, a category mistake. To use the Aristotelian or Thomistic schema, this would be like, if we view abstract ideas or propositions as the genera, this would be one species of the genera, but he's confusing all of the genera for the one species.
I know that's an interesting insight. Thank you. And so, if our core identity is going to be propositional, liberals really just have got it all right. They are ahead of everyone else on this. The current thing is the best thing. Their logic is unassailable. If and only if our core identity is a propositional one. Look around though. Does liberalism seem to have it all right? If not, it's time to rethink propositional identity. Most people intuitively grasp propositionality, but they know it as ideology. This is just one aspect. This is propositionality in politics. Propositionality extends to other domains such as religion, morality, and nationality, and it's equally ugly there. It's one thing to say, I am Han Chinese and therefore Buddhist, but you can't say, I'm Buddhist first because you weren't born a Buddhist. I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but from my understanding, can't you be born a Buddhist? Because, if you're from a Christian family, can't you be born a Christian?
Well, that depends on the Christian denomination, but yes, there are many Christians who do believe you can be born a Christian.
And to freely choose what you are is to be a liberal. Choose your identity is to decide as an individual what you are. And in doing this, you would be really no different than a trans woman. Propositionality is not all bad, only when our core identities are propositional. So can we be rid of our core propositional identities? Yes, because pre-propositional identities, or in other words, folkish identities, are available to us right now. They never disappeared. They were never superseded. You can still be an ethnic Briton. You can still follow the ways of your ancestors. Propositionality didn't replace folkish identities. It built on top of them. And this is the proper order, with the deeper folkish identities at the foundation and the propositional identities as derivative of those. The folkish turn means going back to the root. Modernity means mistaking the root for the branch. So, yes, ultimately, in summary, he's not saying you can't have the propositional identity. It just has to come. Basically, there's like a hierarchy. You have your core, like ethnic heritage comes first, followed by any other propositionalities you have, whether you've got like a political ideology or a religion. But though I think I agree with your point that I do think he's conflating a bit too much between a religious identity and something else like a morality or an ideology. Because I think, though I'm someone who's not personally religious, from what I understand, I think if you're someone who is a sincere religious believer, I think that belief and identity, I think, transcends a lot of these other mundane, earthly aspects. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I would definitely say that. What I would want to say specifically with regards to Christianity is that in order to understand how the Christian individual relates to everything else in the universe, he needs to first understand how he relates to God, and then that reorients his understanding and perspective as to how he relates to everything else. Now, the interesting thing here is this last paragraph, right? Because he says, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it, but I think it's sort of committing a taxi cab fallacy here. He's saying that these beliefs that are propositional developed out of and on top of folkish identities. And so, sure, okay, so the people of a region come up with cultures and traditions, and you could, with enough time of thinking about it through philosophy or religion, sort of view them as abstracted, as abstract objects distinct from the material culture that produced it. But couldn't someone on the left just say, well, look, we're all products of our environment. Now, in this case, I mean actually like a radical environmentalist, like the biosphere. We're a product of that. So if you live in the marshland versus the forest versus the plains or the desert, you're going to develop different material cultures, which will then create different propositional identities. So, for example, you might say the desert just breeds monotheism because of the Arabs and the Jews. Well, why not go that far? Why not go that one step further? Because, yeah, I admit you can't have ideas without people, but you can't have people without an environment. And so if you want to just shift that one step further, that might go in a direction that is not necessarily where Mike's going. So it kind of looks like a taxi cab fallacy.
No, thank you. And it's also interesting because you mentioned about he seems to have a more materialist concept, because ultimately, when we understand what drives history, is it materialism or idealism? Propositionality certainly leans more towards the idealist conception of things, and so by him being more rooted in what is your actual material self, I guess it is a more materialist understanding.
But even if we assume, for the sake of argument, this materialistic understanding, his argument basically hinges on the fact that, well, look, focus identities are prior in time and space to these propositional identities, because it was the focus identities that produced them. Therefore, we should focus our entire political philosophy on this. But what if you talk to a radical environmentalist who said, well, yeah, but what's really more important than even that is the land that you live on and the environmental conditions therein. Why don't we build an entire ideology around that? That would seem to be the same kind of reasoning that he's using, but I don't think he'd want to go there.
No, certainly. And another point, it is all good having a folkish identity, and it's certainly part of what makes you what you are. But I think also this idea of a proposition, in terms of what is this idea of propositional identity. So let's take religion. Well, take England. So ethnically, the English people are the same ethnically as they have been centuries ago. The only difference is that the propositionality. So for most of the history, it would have been their religious identity, whether it was paganism or later on Christianity. But especially when you look at something like Christianity itself has changed a lot in England, because obviously you had the original sort of medieval Christianity, then you had the Reformation and the Anglican Church, you then had the Puritans, and you had the Catholic Revival. Like, there's all these changes that have happened within that sort of propositional identity, and I think a lot of these English Christians would put a lot of stake on their Christian heritage as being part of what makes them English. So I certainly feel, though the ethnic heritage is important, you can't dismiss these propositionalities, so to speak, that sort of emerge from it.
Right, because in a sense, it's kind of a byproduct of that folkish spirit, right? So, and then also you could say too that, let's look to the English again. Even when they do accept identities, like they at first accepted Catholicism and then they converted the Protestant Christian faith, that purely abstracted ideal of that religion was, of course, in some sense, changed in its expression in the English people, right? It wasn't just a pure abstraction. They also, in embracing it, made, I wouldn't say modifications. They didn't necessarily change the belief system, but they shaped it. Now, there was something he mentioned, I think it was either at the end of the introduction or the beginning of his discussion on universalism, where he talks about the fact that you can't doubt your physical existence. Do you remember what that is?
Let's go up. Doubting your physical existence.
Or something like that. He said you couldn't doubt, because in making the distinction between matters of belief, which are propositionality, and then these sort of more like immediate material realities. Maybe it's universalism. Let's see.
Well, something else that's come to my mind, I'm just going to bring up is, I guess another point I would say on this idea of your sort of core heritage identity and the propositional identity is the issue is that, let's take Christianity again. Centuries ago, you could have a propositional identity like being a Christian, and that didn't necessarily override your ethnic heritage. They came together. Whereas now, the modern propositional identity of being, say, a subverted Christian or being, I don't know, like a liberal or something, that completely deracinates you from your ethnic heritage ultimately, and that is probably what the issue is more than anything else.
But this also would separate you from your own religious tradition as well, because it suffered fatal alterations in order to remain a part of this new paradigm.
So perhaps it's not so much a hierarchy, but maybe you should have an ethnic identity and a respectable propositional identity in tandem with one another, rather than necessarily one trumping the other.
Well, I mean, you can't say, now in this regard, I would agree with Mike. In the same sense that you can't decide not to be male or not to be female. You are one or the other. You can't decide not to be, German, Brazilian, or Saudi if you are, right? And if you're not, you can't pretend to be either.
Hold on. So I wasn't saying you couldn't deny your ethnic heritage. What I was more saying is, he's saying that your ethnic heritage completely trumps any propositionalities, no matter what they are. And what I was saying is maybe a more level playing field where you have your ethnic heritage, and then you also have what I would say is a respectable propositional identity. And when I mean that, I mean something like a religious belief or a strong cultural belief, not something like asinine or modern like liberalism or something.
Okay, yeah. Could you scroll up to the introduction? Maybe it's there, or maybe I just understood what he was saying, because it sounded like he was making a distinction between. Okay, he says, okay, it's a matter of belief. Some things are not a matter of belief. First, let's stop to think about what a belief actually is. Oh, okay, then what's not a belief? Here, nationality can also be propositional. Scroll down. Okay, there you go. Does he actually say what are the category of things that aren't beliefs? Because I feel like something was missed here.
Also, there's no point. He said religion can be propositional, but with that statement, you can also imply that religion isn't propositional.
No, but before that, he's in order to define the problem, propositional nation. He says a belief could either be true or false, but some things aren't.
Oh yeah, so he's saying with geocentrism, like if you believe in geocentrism, that's not necessarily untrue. You're just mistaken. So what I think he's trying to say is that with knowledge, there are some things which are like, let's say, like you're born male, you're born female. If you deny that, then you're completely wrong. Whereas if you just have a mistaken belief, that's a different circumstance.
Some things are not a matter of belief. I feel like that he doesn't follow back up on that, because I'm trying to figure out in his mind what are things that are not matters of belief.
Well, I think he's taking it as read that it's your ethnic identity, but then again, saying that, I might be being a bit subversive, but you could also argue that you don't believe in your ethnic identity, which someone could realistically do. It'd be absurd, but it's possible.
Well, because a lot of the work in this essay it's this position that he's critiquing contrasted with something else, and the something else is some things are not a matter of belief, is what I thought he was going to lead into, but I'm not sure what he thinks are things that are not matters of belief. So let me ask you, explain why I think this. They're in philosophy. This is not exactly the same language, but I feel like he's leaning in this direction, but not following through. We can talk about two kinds of beliefs that can be doubted and beliefs that cannot be doubted. And one aspect of beliefs that cannot be doubted are what we call incorrigible, which means these are beliefs that you have intrinsic to yourself. So if you say that I feel pain, that's an incorrigible belief, and you cannot possibly be mistaken that you feel pain. That's just, you either feel pain or you don't. You can't be mistaken about that. Now, you might be mistaken as the cause of the pain. And that's another epistemic problem altogether. And the reason why I ask is because I feel like that there's an underlying logical or philosophical assumption that he's trying to use, which I'm just not seeing. And I'm partly not seeing it because I don't see his contrast. Because what
Mm.
it seems like he's saying is that, well, we can't deny or doubt or question that we're of a certain ethnicity. Or he might also say of a certain sex, male or female, which I would agree with. But he's then saying that, well, the problem with propositions is that these are things you can believe or not believe, prove or disprove. That seems to be the distinction he's making. Would you agree with my assessment on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with your assessment. Yeah.
Okay. So, but here's I guess here's the problem though, right? If we just say, you know, let's look at sex and race. Okay, someone's a white male. Let's call him Frank. Being a white male doesn't actually tell you anything about how you ought to order society and live your life. Those might be important truths about who you are, which determines a whole bunch of your life outcomes and what you can do, but it doesn't tell you what to do.
Oh, that's interesting. So you can almost say being a white male determines who you are and your base instincts, but perhaps a proposition like a religion can then guide you as to what to do with your life and existence.
Yes, right. Because it sounds like Mike isn't. He seems to think that it does tell you what to do, but he doesn't say that explicitly. It's more of an assumed position, and I just don't believe that. I believe that it doesn't actually tell you what to do because he just said it's not a belief. So if it's not a belief, it can't tell you what to do. He might say, "Well, act on instinct." Okay, well, humans can only get so far doing that. We have to do more than just act on instinct. We're not merely animals, but as Aristotle said, we're rational animals. So if you want to say, well, that entails everything we need to know about how to live our lives, well, we'll just be animals in the wilderness, and that's not what I think a lot of the men on the right want. They want an advanced technological society or a civilization of some kind, and in which case, those truths alone won't tell you how to do that.
No, I think in summary, what I'll say about this article is I think his core point of you just can't rely on a propositional identity on its own is bad. I would agree with that. But where I think it fumbles a bit is him trying to explain propositionality itself. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I would want to say that would sum up the mistake I think he makes. Religions, philosophies, and then of course in this particular case, civic nationalism, are all belief systems. Now, he's assuming that all belief systems share in common the things he doesn't like about civic nationalism. And one, that's not proven in the essay. And two, I don't think you could, because I think there's a lot of belief systems that would not entail that kind of reaction or behavior from their adherents, whether it's a philosophy or a religion. And then the other thing I think is, I don't think that while they're important truths, your sex and your ethnic identity, they don't tell you what to do. And so he seems to think that, oh, well, we can lean on them to, more than I think you could, because those truths in and of themselves wouldn't tell you how to live.
Oh, no, certainly. Yeah, thank you. Okay, and so now we're done with the article. What I now want to go over is, hang on, let me just bring this other thing up. Okay, can you see that? It might be a bit.
Not very well. Not
well,
very well.
Hang on, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Yeah. So what I've got here is this is a transcript of a lecture given by the French Orientalist professor Ernest Renan. So he gave it at the Sorbonne in the late 19th century, and it's called "What is a Nation?" and it's him basically explaining what his idea of what makes a modern nation ultimately. And there's a lot of interesting ideas, but I think a lot we're going to be able to critique. Yeah, so I know you've only got like just under an hour left, so I'm not sure if we'll get through all of this, but I think we'll get through enough to have a stimulating conversation. So What I propose to do today is to analyse with you an idea which, though seemingly clear, lends itself to the most dangerous misunderstandings. Consider the vast agglomerations of men found in China, Egypt, or ancient Babylonia, the tribes of the Hebrews and the Arabs, the city as it existed in Athens or Sparta, the assemblies of the various territories in the Carolingian Empire, those communities which are without patrie and are maintained by religious bond alone, as in the case with the Israelites and the Parsees, nations such as France, England, and the majority of modern European states, confederations such as exist in Switzerland or in America, and ties such as those that race, or rather language, establishes between the different branches of the German or Slav peoples. Each of these groupings exist or have existed, and there would be the direst of consequences if one were to confuse any one of them with any other. At the time of the French Revolution, it was commonly believed that the institutions proper to small independent states, such as Sparta and Rome, might be applied to our large nations, which number some 30 or 40 million souls. Nowadays, a far graver mistake is made. Race is confused with nation, and a sovereignty analogous to that of the really existing peoples is attributed to ethnographic or rather linguistic groups. So, what I would say off the back of this is I think he's doing a very classic thing that a lot of 19th century liberals and theorists do. Is he's venerates the classical world. Oh, we love the civic institutions of the classical world, and what their whole idea of modern nationalism is what we want to do is we just want to take the old civics and the government of those ancient states and just transport them onto much larger population groups like the English and the French. So you're basically taking I don't know, like the Athenian democracy, and then transplanting that on top of, England or Britain or France or Germany, ultimately. And this is what a nation is. I don't really agree with this because, well, let's start with the etymology. Nation comes from Latin natio, to be born. So the very idea of a nation goes all the way back to ancient Rome itself. And that, nation doesn't mean, you have these civics or institutions. It means you are a coherent, unique ethnic group with its own identity. And I think another problem with this as well is a lot of these 19th century writers as well. They use the term nation, but what they really mean is nation state, because nation and nation state are different things. A nation is a people. You can have a nation that doesn't have a nation state. So, for example, if you look at the Middle East, the Kurds are a nation. They are a group of people. They don't have a nation state because they're not united in a Kurdistan. Whereas in contrast, France is a nation state because all the French people are united in a nation state, that of France itself. And I think when he says nation, he means nation state, not necessarily a nation itself. Is there anything you want to come back with at all? Or?
Well, given the time in which this man was living, when he says race is confused with nation, I mean, he's technically correct. Because let's say we look at the classic distinction that was given at the time in the early 20th century with the Alpines, would be the North, the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe. And then you had the Nordics, the Alpines, and the Meds. You could be, so the Nords would include Sweden, Scandinavia, Denmark. Those are three different nations. But they all participate, according to the schemas that were popular at Ernst Renan's time, to the Nords.
I know certainly because I know Arthur de Gobineau talks about the Nords a lot in his Inequality of the Races, and it's also interesting because going back to the idea of civic nationalism, this is ultimately, you could say, a form of civic nationalism that our national identity is going to be based on transplanting again these ancient classical institutions onto our modern nation state. So, okay, maybe you could argue we do have a national identity because it is distinctly French or distinctly English, but I think he's probably putting a little bit too much value on those ancient civic institutions.
Well, I actually like those ancient civic institutions, but I think the relevant question, though, is those civic institutions didn't develop in a vacuum. They did develop on top of already existing societies. So the Athenians and the Spartans were both Greeks, but they came with very different political institutions.
Also, just to clarify, not that I'm necessarily opposed to classical institutions or I'm against them. What I was more saying is I think it's more that I lean a bit more to the Spengerian concept of the classical man and Western man being different civilizations, and though you can see there is some inherited values from that older civilization, I do think they're fundamentally different in a lot of ways. Whereas, obviously, I think Renan is buying more into this idea that the West is just this contiguous civilization all the way from ancient Greece to today.
Yeah, that's a more popular one. But even if you do believe in civilizational junctures, you're still building upon some elements of the civilization that preceded you, either unintentionally by building off of the ruins or intentionally by trying to carry forward into the future some aspect of the past.
Well, essentially, that's the Arnold Toynbee conception, because he's got this idea that you have the classical or Hellenic civilization is the parented civilization, and the West is like the offspring or the child civilization. They're two different civilizations, but one was clearly begat by the other, and there is a relationship there.
Yeah, that's what I would take.
Yeah. So I want to now try and make these difficult questions somewhat more precise. For the slightest confusion regarding the meaning of words, at the start of an argument may in the end lead to the most fatal of errors. It is a delicate thing that I propose to do here, something akin to vivisection. I'm going to treat the living much as one ordinarily treats the dead. I shall adopt a absolutely cool and impartial attitude. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, or rather since the disintegration of Charlemagne's empire, Western Europe has seemed to us to be divided into nations, some of which, in certain epochs, have sought to wield a hegemony over the others, without ever enjoying any lasting success. It is hardly likely that anyone in the future will achieve what Charles V, Louis XIV, and Napoleon I tried to do. The founding of a new Roman Empire or of a new Carolingian Empire would now be impossible. Europe is so divided that any bid for universal domination would very rapidly give rise to coalition, which would drive away two ambitious nations back to its natural frontiers. A kind of equilibrium has long been established. France, England, Germany, and Russia will, for centuries to come, no matter what may befall them, continue to be individual historical units, the crucial pieces on the checkerboard whose squares will forever vary in importance and size, but will never be wholly confused with one another. I mean, that's true. There are certainly distinct nations, but just go back to this idea of hegemony of Europe. Obviously, he didn't live beyond the 19th century, he died in 1892, but he obviously is technically incorrect because the mid-century Germans, for a few years at least, did almost achieve a hegemony of Europe before that was undone by the Americans and the Soviets.
Well, but I'm thinking today with the European Union and NATO, I mean, I think that does kind of represent a new Carolingian empire. And in fact, the European Union has the Charlemagne Award, which was given to Kalergi. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it does in some aspects, but it's in a subverted form, I would say.
Well, I think the claim that Renan is making is not necessarily the content of the political unity, but that it just couldn't happen again. Now, he's coming at this from a military perspective. You can't impose by military force this kind of hegemony. And I think he's been proven right, because the hegemony we see today is economic, right? I mean, yes, you could say the U.S. conquered Western Europe after World War II, but Spain and Portugal eventually joined. The Eastern Bloc states eventually joined, and they were not invaded or coerced to do so.
Oh no, that's a fair point. So nations, in this sense of the term, are something fairly new in history. Antiquity was unfamiliar with them. Egypt, China, and ancient Chaldea were in no way nations. They were flocks led by a son of the sun or by the son of heaven. Neither in Egypt nor in China were their citizens as such. Classical antiquity had republics, municipal kingdoms, confederations of local republics, and empires. Yet it can hardly be said to have had nations in our understanding of the term. Athens, Sparta, Tyre, and Sidon were small centres imbued with the most admirable patriotism, but they were simply cities with a relatively restricted territory. Gaul, Spain, Italy, prior to their absorption by the Roman Empire, were collections of clans, which were often allied among themselves but had no central institutions and no dynasties. The Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Empire of Alexander the Great were not patries either. They never were any Assyrian patriots, and the Persian Empire was nothing but a vast feudal structure. No nation traces its origins back to Alexander the Great's momentous adventure, but although it was in consequences for the general history of civilization, I do disagree with this idea that nations are something that are new in history. No, I think nations are very ancient. Again, I'll go back to the whole etymology of nation going back to the Latin. I would say Egypt was a nation because his here's the problem. Renan's issue is that because Egypt was, quote, this autocratic monarchy with the pharaoh lording over the people, that's why it's not a nation. Because I think he's got a egalitarian sense of what a nation is. It's a mass of people who share a culture. And so if they're just these like oppressed peoples living under this tyrant, that's not a nation. But I don't agree. The Egyptians were a people with their own culture and identity.
Well, I would also disagree because, like, I mean, everybody, the ancient sources, the Romans knew that the Greeks were Greeks and they were Romans. Now, there were many Greek political entities, but they knew that they were Roman and they were Greek. So you could say that there was no Greek nation state, but there were Greek nations. And the Greeks understood that the Persians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Scythians were all unique peoples as well, though they may not have been nation states. And I think that's where I think some confusion comes in.
And also he mentions the Assyrian Empire, but the thing is, it's like, okay, the Assyrians, that was an empire, that was a hegemony over the Middle East, but there was still an Assyrian people, an Assyrian nation that dominated that empire.
Right, and there's still an Assyrian people that exist today. They're just relatively inconsequential on the world stage in the Middle East.
Certainly. So, the Roman Empire was much more nearly a patrie. So something I should clarify, patrie is the French word for nation or country. So Roman domination, although at first so harsh, was soon loved, for it had brought about the great benefit of putting an end to war. The empire was a huge association and a synonym for order, peace, and civilization. In its closing stages, lofty souls, enlightened bishops, and the educated classes had a real sense of the Pax Romana, which withstood the threatening chaos of barbarism. But an empire 12 times larger than present-day France cannot be said to be a state in the modern sense of the term. The split between Eastern and Western empires was inevitable. An attempt at founding an empire in Gaul in the 3rd century AD did not succeed either. It was in fact the Germanic invasions which introduced into the world the principle which later was to serve as a basis for the existence of nationalities. So, well, one, I disagree that you can't have a nation that's big. Well, he's basically saying that, a nation is relatively medium to small, it can't be large. Well, look at China. China's absolutely massive, and they're a nation. The Russians as well, they're also a large nation, so I don't agree with him. But also this idea, I would kind of agree with him with I see where he's coming from when he says the Germanic invasions were the basis of nationalities. Well, certainly the creation of the modern European nationalities, because the English from the Anglo-Saxons, the French from the Franks, some of the Italians from the Lombards, etc. I do see where those origins of those nationalities come from out of those invasions, but certainly nations' nationalities did exist before then.
I think the mistake that we're seeing here is he's talking about Europe of his own day, which was a continent of nation states. Nation states didn't really exist in antiquity of the Middle Ages, but that's not to say that nations didn't exist. He's sort of conflating the two.
Yeah, because as I said earlier, I think there's not, in fairness to Renan, it's not only him who does this. I think a lot of other 19th century historians and writers make the same conflation. It's possibly like with the article with Mike. Perhaps he means nation states. He's just assuming you know what he's referring to.
Well, that could be. That could be.
What in fact did the German peoples accomplish from their great invasions in the 5th century AD up until the final Norman conquests in the 10th century? They effected little change in the racial stock, but they imposed dynasties and military aristocracy upon the more or less extensive parts of the old empire of the West, which assumed the names of their invaders. This was the origin of France, Burgundy, and Lombardy, and subsequently Normandy. The Frankish Empire so rapidly extended its sway that for a period it re-established the unity of the West, but it was irreparably shattered around the middle of the 9th century. The partition of Verdun outlined divisions which were in principle immutable, and from then on, France, Germany, England, Italy, and Spain made their way, by often circuitous paths and for 1,001 vicissitudes, to full national existence, such as we see it blossoming today. What in fact is the defining feature of these different states? Is it a fusion of their component populations? In the above-mentioned countries, there was nothing analogous to what you will find in Turkey, where Turks, Slavs, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Syrians, Kurds are as distinct today as they were upon the day they were conquered. Two crucial circumstances helped to bring about this result. First, that the Germanic peoples adopted Christianity as soon as they underwent any prolonged contact with the Greek or Latin peoples. When conqueror or conquered had the same religion, or rather when the conqueror adopts the religion of the conquered, the Turkish system, that is, the absolute distinction between men in terms of their religion, can no longer arise. The second circumstance was the forgetting by the conquerors of their own language. The grandsons of Clovis, Alaric, Gundobald, Alboin, and Roland were already speaking the Roman tongue. This fact was itself the consequence of another important feature, namely that the Franks, Burgundians, Goths, Lombards, and Normans had very few women of their own race with them. For several generations, the chiefs only married German women, but the concubines were Latin, as were the wet nurses of their children. The tribe as a whole married Latin women, which meant that from the time the Franks and the Goths established themselves on Roman territory, the lingua franca and the lingua gothica did not last too long. So just to go back to the Ottoman example, well, there's a reason that the Ottoman Empire was like that, because it is an empire. It's not a nation state. It is a union of all these different nations trapped within this one empire. And just to go along to this idea of the language, I mean, I would certainly agree. And I would say it was more down to, I think, the conversion to Christianity and the adoption of this Latin alphabet as how the language shifted in that direction.
Yeah, so as far as I think, so when he says nations, and I know you made your objections that nations existed before the 19th century. He's clearly talking about nation states, because it becomes clear when he mentions the Turks, and he sort of unpacks all of that, because none of those subgroups have their own independent political state. And yeah, the adoption of the language is partly due to the cultural inertia, right? The Germanic culture at that time was rude and untamed, right? Whereas the Roman culture, whether it's like the Catholic tradition of the West or the Orthodox tradition of the East, goes back, even though Christianity at the time was still relatively new, the civilizational energy that they represented was very old. And so it's like China absorbs the Mongols, right? The Yuan dynasty speaks Chinese because that's just easier to do. It's different with the Turks because the Turks impose their culture, same with the Spanish in Mexico, on another group. And that's partly, I think, because these are conquerors that are more vital than, say, the Asiatic nomads that conquer China or the Germans that conquer the Western Roman Empire.
So in a way, there are more civilized people bringing up a lesser people, so to speak.
Yeah, you could argue that that's what the Turks and the Spanish did.
Certainly. Because it's interesting, because I mentioned Toynbee earlier, and going back to this idea of the barbarian invasions, because Toynbee has this concept, essentially, that it wasn't so much that the barbarians had greater vitality than the Romans, it was more the fact that the Roman Empire was effectively this impotent corpse by the very end, and the barbarians were just vultures picking up the corpse. And then it was what he calls the universal church of Christianity, which had the vitality and energy, and it then passed that on, and that's why it was able to absorb the barbarians into the body of Christianity.
Yeah. So that would sort of be like the Western version of what happens in China. They get overrun by nomads, but Chinese culture is, more settled, more richer and deeper, and it absorbs it usually.
Certainly. This is not how it was in England, for the invading Saxons undoubtedly brought women with them. The Celtic population took flight, and besides, Latin was no longer, or rather had never been, dominant in Britain. If Old French had been generally spoken in Gaul in the 5th century, Clovis and his people would not have abandoned German for Old French. The crucial result of all of this was that, in spite of the extreme violence of the customs of the German invaders, the mould which they imposed became, with the passing centuries, the actual mould of the nation. France became quite legitimately the name of a country to which only a virtually imperceptible minority of Franks had come. In the 10th century, in the first chansons de geste, which are such a perfect mirror of the spirit of the times, all the inhabitants of France are French. The idea, which had seemed so obvious to Gregory of Tours, that the population of France was co-imposed to different races, was no way apparent to French writers and poets after Hugh Capet. The difference between noble and serf was as sharply drawn as possible, but it was in no sense presented as an ethnic difference. It was presented rather as a difference in courage, customs, and education, all of which were transmitted hereditarily. It did not occur to anyone that the origin of all this was a conquest. The spurious system according to which nobility owed its origin to a privilege conferred by the king for services rendered to the nation, so that every noble was an ennobled person, was established as a dogma as early as the 13th century. The same thing took place after all the Norman conquests. After 1 or 2 generations, the Norman invaders no longer distinguished themselves from the rest of the population. Though their influence was not any less profound because of this fact, they had given the conquered territory a nobility, military habits, and a patriotism that they had not known before. So I think what he's saying here is that ultimately a nation is begun by a elites coming in, if you like, that conquer the territory and then set up the institutions and their own rule. And as time goes on, though the people under them may not necessarily share the culture, a new national culture is created, which the people are sort of, dare I say, indoctrinated into over the long course of time.
That seems to be what he's saying, but he's really only using 2 examples, England and France. And he also seems to think that there's going to be some sort of amalgamation, because he said it's obvious to Gregory of Tours that France was populated by different races, but then by Hugh Capet they weren't. So what does he mean by race in this context? I mean, when
I'm assuming he means the Franks, the Germanic invaders, and then the native Gallo-Roman inhabitants. And it's interesting he makes this point because, as I said, this is around the late 19th century. Because in the late 19th century, arguably, the French identity was still being constructed. Because there's a great book that's been recommended to me before, but I've never got around to reading. But I've read a summary of it. It's called "Peasants into Frenchmen" by Eugene Weber. And the subtitle is "The Modernization of Rural France." And it's about how in the late 19th century, the French government made an explicit effort to try and engender a national French culture, because at this time, even after the Franco-Prussian War, there was a lot of regional identities in France. You've got the Bretons, you've got the Gascons, you've got Burgundians, you've got all these different local communities with their own dialects, language, and cultures. And the French government believed that one of the reasons they lost the Franco-Prussian War was they had failed to engender a truly national identity of France. And so they spent the next few decades using their new education system to try and foster this French identity amongst the masses of the population. And, as we saw by World War One, when obviously France went into that war, we could definitely say that the French people had a much stronger sense of a national identity by that conflict.
Yeah, I think France had a much stronger national identity. And yeah, I would agree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Forgetting I would ever go so far as to say historical error is a crucial factor in the creation of a nation, which is why progress in historical studies often constitutes a danger for the principle of nationality. Indeed, historical inquiry brings to light deeds of violence which took place at the origin of all political formations, even of those whose consequences have been altogether beneficial. Unity is always affected by means of brutality. The union of normal France with the Midi was a result of massacres and terror lasting for the best part of a century. Though the King of France was, if I may make so bold as to say, almost a perfect instance of an agent that crystallized a nation over a long period, though he established the most perfect national unity that there ever has been, too searching a scrutiny had destroyed his prestige. The nation which he had fought had cursed him, and nowadays it is only men of culture who know something of his former value and of his achievements. It is only by contrast that these great lords of the history of Western Europe became perceptible to us. Many countries failed to achieve what the King of France, partly through his tyranny, partly through his justice, so admirably brought to fruition. Under the crown of St. Stephen, the Magyars and the Slavs have remained as distinct as they were 800 years ago. Far from managing to fuse the diverse ethnic elements to be found in its domains, the House of Habsburg has kept them distinct and often opposed to one to the other. In Bohemia, for instance, the Czech and German elements are superimposed, much like oil and water in a glass. The Turkish policy of separating nationalities according to their religion has had much graver consequences, brought about the downfall of the East. If you take a city such as Salonika or Smyrna, you'll find there 5 or 6 communities, each of which had its own memories, which have almost nothing in common. Yet the essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common, and also that they have forgotten many things. No French citizen knows whether he is a Burgundian, an Alan, a Tefel, or a Visigoth. Yet every French citizen has to have forgotten the massacre of St. Bartholomew, or the massacres that took place in the Midi in the 13th century. There are not 10 families in France that can supply proof of their Frankish origin, and any such proof would anyway be essentially flawed, as a consequence of countless unknown alliances which are liable to disrupt any genealogical system. The modern nation is therefore a historical result brought about by a series of convergent facts. Sometimes unity has been affected by a dynasty, as was in the case in France. Sometimes it's been brought about by the direct will of provinces, as was the case with Holland, Switzerland, and Belgium. Sometimes it's been the work of a general consciousnness, belatedly victorious over the caprices of feudalism, as was the case in Italy and Germany. These formations always had a profound raison d'etre. Principles in such cases always emerge through the most unexpected surprises. Thus, in our own day, we have seen Italy unified through its defeats and Turkey destroyed by its victories. Each defeat advanced the cause of Italy. Each victory spelled the doom for Turkey. But Italy is a nation, and Turkey, outside of Asia Minor, is not one. France can claim the glory for having, through the French Revolution, claimed that a nation exists of itself. We should not be displeased if others imitate us in this. It was we who founded the principle of nationality, but what is a nation? Why is Holland a nation when Hanover or the Grand Duchy Parma are not? How is it that France continues to be a nation when the principle which created it has disappeared? How is it that Switzerland, which has 3 languages, 2 religions, and 3 or 4 races, is a nation when Tuscany, which is so homogeneous, is not one? Why is Austria a state and not a nation? In what ways does the principle of nationality differ from that of races? These are points that a thoughtful person would wish to have settled. In order to put his mind at rest, the affairs of the world can hardly be said to be ruled by reasonings of this sort. Yet diligent men are desirous of bringing some reason into these matters and of ravelling the confusions in which superficial intelligences are entangled. So, what we're seeing, Renan believes ultimately that a nation is a historical process. And to borrow a phrase from Apostolic Majesty, history is a process of becoming. So France as itself has been developed over the centuries. It was originally created by the Franks and then formalized under the different dynasties, the Merovingians, the Carolingians, the Capets, etc. But now, obviously, in this post-revolutionary France, where there's no longer a kingdom or a monarchical government, how is it that the French are still able to maintain an identity? And, well, ultimately, with the creation of a new government that is interested in providing that identity. And this is where I think a lot of the civic nationalist concepts come out in Renan, as we'll get into as we go further down. He believes that ultimately, a king or a tribe is not civic, but it can create something. Whereas to really create a sort of a civic nationality that's to be preserved, you need these sort of modern civic institutions ultimately.
Well, it's interesting here that back to an objection you had earlier, you're like, well, you believe that there were nations in antiquity. See, he's using these terms in ways that I wasn't expecting, because he says Switzerland was composed of 3 or 4 races. So that'd be like German, French, Italian, and I don't know what the other one would be. So these kinds of national divisions that we're talking about, he calls races. So I guess he's just using a different vocabulary.
I think the problem could also be is that obviously he is French and this is translated from French, so it could be a translation issue as well.
That could be too.
Mm-hmm. So, 2. If one were to believe some political theorists, a nation is above all a dynasty representing an earlier conquest, one which was first of all accepted and then forgotten by the mass of the people. According to the above-mentioned theorists, the grouping of provinces affected by a dynasty, by its wars, its marriages, its treaties, ends with the dynasty which had established it. It is quite true that the majority of modern nations were made by a family of feudal origin, which had contracted a marriage with the soil and which was in some sense a nucleus of centralization. France's frontiers in 1789 had nothing even natural or necessary about them. the wide zone that the House of Capet had added to the narrow strip of land granted by the partition of Verdun was indeed the personal acquisition of this house. During the epoch when their acquisitions were made, there was no idea of natural frontiers, nor because among its numerous reigning houses, none prior to the present century constituted itself as the centre of its unity. Strangely enough, it was through the obscure island of Sardinia, a land that was scarcely Italian, that the House of Savoy assumed a royal title. Holland, which through an act of heroic resolution created itself, has nevertheless contracted an intimate marriage with the House of Orange, and it will run real dangers the day this union is compromised. In such a law, however, absolute, it absolutely is not. Switzerland and the United States, which have formed themselves like conglomerates by successive additions, have no dynastic basis. I shall not discuss the question in relation to France, for I would need to be able to read the secrets of the future in order to do so. Let me simply say that so loftily national had this great French royal principle been that, on the morrow of its fall, the nation was able to stand without her. Furthermore, the 18th century had changed everything. Man had returned after centuries of abasement to the spirit of antiquity, to a sense of respect for herself, to the idea of his own rights. The words patrie and citizen had recovered their former meanings. Thus it was that the boldest operation ever yet put into effect in history was brought into completion, an operation which one might compare with the attempt in physiology to restore to its original identity a body from which one had removed the brain and the heart. So again, what Renan is really saying here is that in his mind, to really be a proper nation, so to speak, you not own. Yes, it can be created by a king or a tribe originally, but to really come to its sort of, you can almost say, evolutionary maturity, you have to adopt these civic concepts, which is borrowing from the ancient world. You have to address each other as citizens. You have to have like a constitution. You have to have like a national assembly. If you don't have these things, you're not a nation. And I'm sorry, I don't agree.
Well, the idea that, well, again, let's look at like the ancient Greeks, right? They had different political constitutions, but everybody still knows them as Greeks.
I know certainly, but this is what I mean. He's looking back at something like Athens and thinking, oh, because they had the they've got their democratic assembly, and because they're all citizens, and you've got the metics, they can distinguish foreigners from their own people. They therefore had a consciousness of themselves as a nation and a people. Yeah, but so I would argue so did the French, because I mean, think about it. Let's go back to the 100 Years' War, which was in the 14th and 15th centuries, and Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc would not have been able to have rallied to the defence of France and helped defeat England if there wasn't a sense of French national identity. If the French people were entirely deracinated from any kind of national identity, then that wouldn't have been possible now, would it?
Well, right. She had to appeal to an already existing identity, but I don't see where Renan is saying that you have to have democratic institutions to be a nation, because medieval France and France prior to the Revolution certainly did not have democratic institutions.
No, certainly not. No.
But Renan still considers that the nation of France, right?
Well, basically, here's what he thinks. Again, is what I said. He seems to believe that a nation is an idea that's in constant development or evolution, or it progresses, as it were. So the nation can be created by a king, for example, but for it to be maintained and to progress and to develop, to become stronger, it then has to develop civic institutions, ultimately, I think is what he's driving at.
Well, you have to develop institutions larger than a local community. Like you said with that book about turning French peasants into Frenchmen, their loyalties were not primarily directed towards the state. That was the problem. They were primarily directed at a more horizontal level to each other.
I know, certainly. Okay. It must therefore be admitted that a nation can exist without a dynastic principle, and even that nations which have been formed by dynasties can be separated from them without therefore ceasing to exist. The old principle, which only takes account of the right of princes, can no longer be maintained. Apart from dynastic right, there is also national right. From what criterion, however, should one base this national right? By what sign should one know it? From what tangible facts can one derive it? Several confidently assert that it is derived from race, the artificial divisions resulting from feudalism, from princely marriages, from diplomatic congresses are, these authors assert, in a state of decay. It is the population's race which remains firm and fixed. This is what constitutes a right to legitimacy. The Germanic family, according to the theory I am expounding here, has the right to reassemble the scattered limbs of the Germanic order, even when these limbs are not asking to be joined together again. The right of the Germanic order over such and such a province is stronger than the right of the inhabitants of that province over themselves. There was thus created a kind of primordial right analogous to the divine right of kings. An ethnographic principle is substituted for a national one. That's a very great error which, if it were to become dominant, would destroy European civilization. The primordial right of races is as narrow as perilous for genuine progress as the national principle is just and legitimate. In the tribes and cities of antiquity, the fact of face was, I will allow, of very real importance. The tribe and the city were then merely extensions of the family. At Sparta and at Athens, all the citizens were kin to a greater or lesser degree. The same was true of the Beni Israelites. This is still the case with the Arab tribes. If we now move now from Athens, Sparta, and the Israelite tribes to the Roman Empire, the situation is a wholly different one. Established at first through violence, but subsequently preserved through common interest, this great agglomeration of cities and provinces, wholly different from each other, dealt the gravest of blows to the idea of race. Christianity, with its universal and absolute character, worked still more effectively in the same direction. It formed an intimate alliance with the Roman Empire, and through the impact of these two incomparable unifactory agents, the ethnographic argument was debarred from the government of human affairs for centuries. The barbarian invasions were, appearances notwithstanding, a further step along the same path. The carving out of the barbarian kingdoms had nothing ethnographic about them. Their shape was determined by might or whim of the invaders. They were utterly indifferent to the race of the populations which they had subdued. What Rome had fashioned, Charlemagne refashioned in his own way, namely a single empire composed of the most diverse races. Those responsible for the partition of Verdun, as they calmly drew their two long lines from north to south, were not in the slightest concerned with the race of the peoples to be found on the right or left of these lines. Frontier changes put into effect as the Middle Ages wore on likewise paid no heed to ethnographic divisions. If the policies pursued by the House of Capet by and large resulted in the grouping together under the name of France or the territories of ancient Gaul, this was only because their lands had a natural tendency to be joined together with their fellows. Dauphine, Bresse, Provence, and Franche-Comté no longer recalled any common origin. All Gallic consciousness had perished by the 2nd century AD. It is only from a purely scholarly perspective that, in our own days, the individuality of the Gallic character has been retrospectively recovered. So, in Renan's view, ultimately, it's only with modern France post-revolution that this idea of a Gallic identity has been rediscovered. Again, Renan is this seems to love this sort of reaching back into the past, and we've rediscovered the ancients or the glories of the past, and that's what making a good nation is. But the thing is, what I think is really missing when looking at the Franks and the Treaty of Verdun, where you had the partition of Charlemagne's empire into West Francia, Lotharingia, and East Francia, is, especially with the kings of France, West Francia, what was the title of the kings for about 700 years? It was the King of the Franks. It wasn't, because though from Philip Augustus it would become King of France, it again before then had been King of the Franks. There was this idea that king was a tribal ethnarch. He is the chieftain of his own national or ethnic group.
Well, one of the things here that I just partly I'm looking at history that hadn't yet happened from Renan's point of view, but there's some things I think he's just terribly wrong on. So while it's true that the medieval houses that competed for let's say the market share of Europe didn't really care a whole lot about who they were ruling over as long as they could extract value from the provinces. This idea that that the liberalism of his own day and that the rise of the nation state was not primarily ethnic driven is ridiculous. That's exactly what drove the unification of Germany and Italy, which had taken place by the time of him writing this. And the instability of the Ottoman and Habsburg empires fell apart in the face of nations seeking to assert themselves based on their ethnic identity. I mean, that I think is the problem with looking at the modern nation state the way he is, because the nationalism itself comes from the French. The French invent the idea of nationalism. We're not German, we're not Spanish, we're French. And so if we're gonna argue that, if Renan is gonna argue that it's more progressive to not care about race, medieval Europe was more progressive than 19th or 20th century Europe, because the ideology of state formation that he's talking about was entirely nationalistic. One of the things that motivated the Italian unification was that the Austrians were controlling large parts of Italy.
Certainly, and I think one of the issues here is that because Renan is French and he's clearly very well versed in French history, I think he's making the error of trying to explain the French course of history as explaining European nationalism as a whole, when it didn't quite all go that way.
Yeah, but now, of course, by the time I don't know when this was written. His life, he said he died in 1892.
Yes, this is the 1880s, I believe. This lecture.
Okay, so Italy and Germany have already been unified, and they were unified along ethnic lines. They because the empires that were imposed on them didn't respect their identities. And then, of course, after World War One, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the states that arose were organized as much as possible on these national lines.
And it's interesting, if we go back to the idea of the Habsburg Empire, we'll remember by this point it was also Austria-Hungary. The Hungarian side of the empire, or Transylvania, was basically a national state. So that the Hungarian side, the Kingdom of Hungary, was ruled by a very nationalistic Hungarian elite that wanted to try and incorporate all the other ethnic groups, the Slovaks, the Romanians, the Serbs, etc., all into a Hungarian national identity. Where in Cisleithania, the Austrian side of the empire, the Austrians kept making concessions to the various groups, whether it's the Czechs or the Poles or even the Ukrainians.
Yeah, but ultimately, I'm just trying to figure out what his theory is. He uses, maybe it's a translation issue. The way he uses race and nation seems confusing to me, and he seems to argue that national formation in Europe is anti-nationalistic. Almost all the wars of the 19th century were about racial lines, or at least national lines. Like, well, this is a German territory, this is an Italian territory, this is a French territory. Whereas, like in medieval Europe, say the 100 Years' War, it wasn't really an ethnic struggle. It was two royal dynasties seeking to exert control over France.
Well, one thing I will say is, Renan's main area of expertise is that he was an Orientalist, so he was an expert on the cultures and history of the Middle East, and also an expert on Middle Eastern languages. And so this lecture is a bit outside of his wheelhouse. I think in some aspects that possibly is why it is a bit muddled. But one thing I would say is it's interesting because obviously he's an Orientalist. He's very well acquainted with the culture and history of the Middle East, and obviously the historical national development of the Middle East is very different to that of the West. And I think what he's doing is he's looking at his own country, France, and comparing it to, say, somewhere like the Ottoman Empire. And because these are things have got very different developments, I think that's why he's sort of coming from. He's thinking, oh, France, this is how we do things in the West, when it's like, well, no, that's just one example.
Yeah, that could be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Ethnographic considerations have therefore played no part in the constitution of modern nations. France is at once Celtic, Iberic, and Germanic. Germany is Germanic, Celtic, and Slav. Italy is the country where the ethnographic argument is most confounded. Gauls, Etruscans, Pelasgians, and Greeks, not to mention many other elements, intersect in an indecipherable mixture. The British Isles, considered as a whole, present a mixture of Celtic and Germanic blood, the portions of which are singularly difficult to define. Truth is that there is no pure race, and that to make politics depend upon ethnographic analysis is to render it to a chimera. The noblest countries, England, France, and Italy, are those where the blood is the most mixed. Is Germany an exception in this respect? Is it a purely Germanic country? This is a complete illusion. The whole of the south was once Gallic. The whole of the east from the river Elbe is Slav. Even those parts which are claimed to be really pure, are they in fact so? We touch here on one of those problems in regards to which it is of the utmost importance that we equip ourselves with the clear ideas and ward of misconceptions. Discussions of race are interminable because philologically minded historians and physiologically minded anthropologists interpret the term in two totally different ways. For the anthropologists, race is the same meaning as in zoology. It serves to indicate real descent and blood relation. However, the study of language and of history does not lead to the same divisions as does physiology. Words such as brachycephalic or dolichocephalic have no place in either history or philology. In the human group which created the eye and languages and way of life, there was already brachycephalics and dolichocephalics. The same is true of the primitive group which created the languages and institutions known as Semitic. In other words, the zoological origins of humanity are massively prior to the origins of culture, civilization, and language. The primitive Aryan, primitive Semitic, and primitive Turanian groups have no physiological unity. These groupings are historical facts which took place in a particular epoch, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, while the zoological origin of humanity is lost in impenetrable darkness. What is known philologically and historically as the Germanic race is no doubt a quite distinct family within the human species, but is it a family in the anthropological sense of the term? Certainly not. The emergence of an individual Germanic identity occurred only a few centuries prior to Jesus Christ. One may take it that the Germans did not emerge from the earth at this epoch. Prior to this, mingled with the Slavs and the huge instinct mass of the Scythians, they did not have their own separate individuality. An Englishman is indeed a type within the whole of humanity. However, the type of what is quite improperly called Anglo-Saxon race is neither the Briton or Julius Caesar's time, nor the Anglo-Saxon of Hengist's time, nor the Dane of Canute's time, nor the Norman of William the Conqueror's time. It is rather the result of all these elements. A Frenchman is neither a Gaul, nor a Frank, nor a Burgundian. Rather, he is what has emerged out of the cauldron in which, presided over by the King of France, the most diverse elements have together been simmering. A native of Jersey or Guernsey differs in no way, as far as his origins are concerned, from the Norman population of the opposite coast. In the 11th century, even the sharpest eye would have seen not the slightest difference in those living on either side of the Channel. Trifling circumstances meant that Philip Augustus did not seize these islands together with the rest of Normandy. Separated from each other by the best part of 700 yards, the two populations have become not only strangers to each other, but wholly dissimilar. Race, as we historians understand it, is therefore something which is made and unmade. The study of race is of crucial importance for the scholar concerned with the history of humanity. It has no application whatsoever in politics. The indistinctive consciousness which presides over the construction of the map of Europe took no account of race, and the leading nations of Europe are nations essentially of mixed blood. So, fundamentally, why Renan rejects a kind of racial nationalism, his argument is, well, we're all technically mixed ethnicity or mixed race, so to claim some kind of identity based on ethnic purity is absurd. But the thing is not the mixing of this blood, not just creating a brand new race or people from which to base an identity.
Well, the other thing to say is, just because a concept had no place in the developmental process of statecraft in the past doesn't follow that it can't in the future. He just seems to want to make a fiat claim. Oh, okay, but why? I mean, it could change. I mean, we went from classical institutions to medieval monarchies. You know, I mean, it wouldn't have done any good to tell Clovis, well, you know, we're not, or Caesar, Augustus Caesar, well, we're not really used to an autocracy here because we historically have had republics, you know. Well, then Augustus would say, well, you overthrew the kings back in the day, back in, the 6th century. So it's not determinative.
Oh, no, certainly. Okay. So the fact of race, which originally crucial, thus becomes increasingly less important. Human history is essentially different from zoology, and race is not everything as it is among the rodents or the felines, and one does not have the right to go through the world fingering people's skulls and taking them by the throat saying, you are of our blood, you belong to us. Aside from anthropological characteristics, there are such things as reason, justice, the true and the beautiful, which are the same for all. Be on your guard, for the ethnographic politics is in no way a stable thing, and if today you use it against others, tomorrow you may see it turned against yourselves. Can you be sure that the Germans who have raised the banner of ethnography so high will not see the Slavs in their turn analyse the names of villages in Saxony and Lusatia, search for any traces of the Wiltzes or of the Obotrites, and demand recompense for the massacres and the wholesale enslavements that the Otos inflicted upon their ancestors? It is good for everyone to know how to forget. I mean, I suppose it's true that you shouldn't, obsess over the atrocities of the past, but the thing is, the reason you can resist people demanding, revenge or recompense is that you are strong enough to be able to prevent other ethnic groups from dominating you. Because if you're dominant, then they can't do that to you ultimately.
Well, I mean, I guess in a sense, again, history hadn't happened yet from Renan's point of view. But with the kind of revanchist claims of non-white minorities galvanized by the left, what he feared happened seems to be happening.
Oh, got a comment from Namio Kazan. I had a quick look at the French version of this article, and Ernst Renan does indeed use the word race in the way you two are understanding it. Oh, thank you for clarifying that, Nami.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. I'm very fond of ethnography, for it is a science of rare interest, but insofar as I wish it to be free, I wish it to be without political application. In ethnography, as in all forms of study, systems change. This is a condition of progress. States' frontiers would then follow the fluctuations of science. Patriotism would depend upon the more or less paradoxical dissertation. One would come up to a patriot and say, "You were mistaken. You shed your blood for such and such a cause. You believed yourself to be a Celt, not at all. You are a German." And 10 years later, you will be told that you are a Slav. If we are to not distort science, we should exempt from it the need to give an opinion on these problems in which so many interests are involved. You can be sure that if one obliges science to furnish diplomacy with its first principles, one will surprise her many times in flagrant delict. She has better things to do. Let us simply ask her to tell the truth. What we have just said of race applies to language too. Language invites people to unite, but it does not force them to do so. The United States and England, Latin America and Spain speak the same languages, yet do not form single nations. Conversely, Switzerland, so well made since sight was made with the consent of her different parts, numbers 3 or 4 languages. There's something in man which is superior to language, namely the will. The will of Switzerland to be united in spite of the diversity of her dialects is a fact of far greater importance than the similitude often obtained by various vexatious measures. An honourable fact about France is that she has never sought to win unity of language by coercive measures. Can one not have the same sentiments and the same thoughts? I love the same things in different languages. I was speaking just now of the disadvantage of making international politics depend upon ethnography. They would be no less if one were to make it depend upon comparative philology. Let us allow these intriguing studies full freedom of discussion. Let us not mix them up with the matters which would undermine their serenity. The political importance attached to languages derives from their being regarded as a sign of race. Nothing could be more false. Prussia, where only German is now spoken, spoke Slav a few centuries ago. In Wales, English is spoken. Gaul and Spain speak the primitive dialects of Alba Longa. Egypt speaks Arabic. There are countless other examples one could quote. Even if you go back to origin, similarity of language did not presuppose similarity of race. Consider, for example, the Proto-Aryan or Proto-Semitic tribe. The one found slaves speaking the same language as their masters, yet the slave was often enough a different race to that of his master. Let me repeat that these divisions of the Indo-European, Semitic or other languages, created with such an admirable sagacity by comparative philology, do not coincide with the divisions established by anthropology. Languages are historical formations which tell us very little about the blood of those who speak them, and which, in any case, could not shackle human liberty when it is a matter of deciding the family with which one unites oneself for life or for death. So it's interesting him leaning into the idea of language here, and because the thing is, he talks about the Welsh speaking English. Well, to say the Welsh speak English doesn't mean the Welsh aren't a nation. Of course, the Welsh see themselves as a nation. They have their own cultural heritage and their traditions. They only speak English because they were conquered and absorbed into an English-dominated state.
Well, and the other thing is, it's ridiculous to say France never sought to win unity of language by coercive measures. I mean, tell that to the French-speaking parts of Africa. Why do they speak French? They weren't asked politely to speak French.
No, certainly, and also it's really silly, this idea of nationalism based on language. But by that logic, are all French-speaking Africans French?
Well, yeah. So, well, like I said, I feel like this is just kind of muddled. There's concepts that are not fully developed, and he's kind of like pivoting all over the place. I'm not really sure what his common theme is.
Again, bringing up all of the Arabs and the Semites, he's again, I think, leaning on his Orientalist field of expertise here, and I think he's trying to lean on what he knows he's an expert on to shore up his argument. But again, it's, I think, inappropriate considering the vastly different cultures and peoples we're dealing with here. So obviously, I know you've not got much time, so you've got to go and do your own stream, Todd. But one final thing I want to go over is that we haven't quite got to it yet, but there is a very famous quote Renan uses later in this lecture, where he makes the argument that, in his view, nations are what he calls are a daily plebiscite, and they're very much an action of national memory. So nations, in his mind, are something the people of a country have to consciously opt into in order for it to carry on existing, and they have to remember and worship it and sort of maintain the preservation of its culture. Again, you obviously see a lot of CivNat elements to this. The idea of a plebiscite, the idea that people vote into the system or the national culture is something you can just opt into, and if you don't want to opt into it, that's fine. Well, no, you are English or you are French. You can't get away from that. You can't just vote your way in and out of it. And though the stronger element of that quote is obviously the idea, I do agree that national memory is important, and if people become deracinated and don't remember their traditional cultures, then certainly that is bad and will lead to a decline in your national culture and identity.
Well, I'll just say that because that's an interesting contrast to what Imperium Press was saying, that it's not a choice. I think ultimately, though, the problem here is that what you're calling nation, he's calling race. Because he's at that quote where he says there's 3 or 4 different races in Switzerland. So I think he would agree that you don't choose your race. And when he means nation, he means nation state. And a nation state is a constructed political system.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I see what Renan's trying to do, but it's basically, you've got a man who has an expertise in one field. He's decides to do a foray into another field, using his expertise from his other field to then try and shore up an argument ultimately. And I don't blame his efforts, but this is very, very muddled and confused.
Now, this happens a lot. That's what, Noam Chomsky's a linguist, but he does politics. Why not?
It's like Neil deGrasse Tyson tries to use his knowledge of astrophysics to try and explain modern society.
Yeah, it just doesn't work.
No. Well, thank you very much for taking part in this episode, Todd. Is there anything you would like to share before we get out of here?
As you mentioned, I have a show in about 12 minutes, so you can just tune into the Praise of Fire podcast and listen to my reading of The Old Book Conspiracy, which is the 3rd book in my technological dictatorship series. 2 books written by Bertrand Russell, 2 by H.G. Wells, which explain the motivations of the people in charge of us now and why our society looks the way it does.
Oh, sounds fascinating. No, everybody go and check out Todd's channel and watch his stream. So in terms of this show, next week on Tuesday, I'm going to be joined by Hunger, and we're going to be tackling Israel, Palestine, and potentially Lebanon, considering the Israel's impending invasion of that country. So if you want more Middle Eastern shenanigans, please stay tuned for that. And of course, we hope to also in a couple of weeks return to the Chatham House series, where we'll be discussing the Kingdom of Iraq and what a complete disaster the creation of that country was ultimately. So thank you everybody for watching, and good night.